Well, good evening to all of you. And I sit here where I stood every Sunday for a long time with the privilege of being the teacher of the auditorium class. And I see your great faces that I remember. A few of you I have come in since I left, and I am looking forward to being able to learn who you are. And I want to tell you, it just feels like home. And I don't want it ever to pass into the point that it doesn't feel like home. I hold this congregation in high esteem because, if for no other reason, that you all patiently listened to me for those 11 plus years. And you listened to me like I knew what I was talking about, and I'm not sure I did, but I surely did enjoy being a part of your lives. And I resigned here in June of 16, and then I was preaching at a lot of different places for a couple of years. And Phyllis and I moved to Nashville in May of 18 in order to be closer to our children, but primarily to be closer to our doctors. And we needed a lot of doctors at that time. And so we're grateful that we can come back and be a part of this. And I look today to confirm what I was thinking, that the last time I was in this auditorium to speak to you was July 28, 2021. So it's been 2 years to the day, not to the date, but to the day. And I'm grateful to your elders for the invitation to come back and be with you. And I want to say something of a personal nature about your preacher. Steve and I met for the first time, along with his wife, at a funeral in Huntsville. The secretary for the Lincoln Church, where I preached for 7 years, had passed, and she had some relatives and good friends in this area, and they came down with all three of your elders and their wives. And I got to meet Steve, and I've heard so many good things about him, and I still continue to be impressed with what I hear about him. So I just tell you, I'm glad that West Fayetteville has him as a minister of the gospel, because I think you're in good hands with that. And Steve, you just keep up the good work, brother. We went to Nashville, as I said, in May of 18. And those of you who worshiped with us here know that we have two children. Our oldest is our daughter Rhonda, and then the youngest is our son Aaron. And those two, with their families, were living right there in the Nashville area. Many of them have moved on out to other places, so some of them we seldom see. But Aaron has his first grandson. I'll look to Phyllis for confirmation. He's 2 now, 2 years old. And Rhonda has 9. She has 3 children. Her daughter has 4. Her son has 4. And her daughter, Hannah, has 2. And her other daughter, Claire, has 3. So Rhonda is the grandmother of 9, and Aaron with 1. So Phyllis and I have 10 grandchildren. And I have to look to Phyllis or look at my calendar to keep up with all of them, how old they are and so on. But let me tell you something. In preparation for this, I got online, I started looking, and you can find out all kinds of things, of course, online. But our daughter had sent to us a text that told about a woman that fascinated me, so I looked her up online. Maydale Hawkins is her name. She was born in Kentucky. And at the age of 16, she married a man that was already 50. And he already had a couple of children, but together they've had other children, so that Maydell now has 13 children, and she's 98 years old. She has, now for you that think you've got a lot of grandchildren, listen to this. She has 106 grandchildren. 106. And then, of course, a lot of them are old enough, they're married and they have children, so her great-grandchildren that number into the 300s. And recently, she met a great-grandchild, had brought her new baby into the world and brought that baby to see Maydell, and that's Maydell's 38th great-great-great-grandchild. So, can you imagine what a family gathering that is? Grandchildren can capture your heart like nothing else. And one of my favorite stories, a grandmother had flown out to Texas to see her grandchildren. One of her daughters had 3 or maybe 4 children. She went out there to see them, and of course, with all these iPhones and everything, they're making pictures the whole time. So when she got back on the airplane to make that journey back home, and it was a 2.5-hour flight, she sat down by some man that she didn't know, but she wasn't the least bit bashful, and she made his acquaintance and started talking to him. And she didn't ask, she just said, I want to show you pictures of my grandchildren. Now I know you all are grinning because you do the same thing, or you've been the one that's been shown those pictures. For the next hour plus, she showed him just dozens and dozens and dozens of pictures, told him the whole life story of every one of those grandkids, and just kept on, and she just talked and she talked and she talked, and he wasn't saying anything. He was just sitting there trying to be polite and listening to her. And after about an hour and 15 minutes, she said, listen to me. I'm just sitting here doing all the talking, telling you about all of my grandchildren, and not even giving you an opportunity to talk. Now it's your turn. Now tell me what you think about my grandchildren. And I thought, yeah, I can easily relate to that. Grandchildren have a power. And some of you have just in recent months or recent years experienced that power. Because grandchildren can take a mature, normal, very reasonable and calm adult and turn that adult into silly putty. I've seen it happen so many times. And you see daddies that will just hardly talk about anything around the house, but when a grandchild comes, oh my, they're just silly about it. And I demonstrated that in my life a number of years ago. I remember telling a few of you here at West Fayetteville about it, but I'm going to tell it again because it illustrates what I'm talking about, and it reminds me that I've had my turns of being silly. Rhonda, as I mentioned, has 2 girls. They're twins. And when we were living in Florence, Alabama, and I was preaching at Wood Avenue where we worshiped for 27 years, I was in the pulpit one Sunday. I had a microphone very similar to this one clipped onto my tie. And I preached. Rhonda came that Sunday with her children. And they were sitting off over to my right. And near the end of my sermon, I noticed Rhonda had to get up and take the girls out. And it wasn't because they were misbehaving. One of them just needed to go to the restroom very badly. And so she took those girls out. And I didn't think any more about it. One of those was Claire. And Claire, from the time she was a little baby, she thought the only place in the world for her to be was in my lap or in my arms. And we were just so close, and she'd holler for me. And they call me Papa, they call Phyllis Mimi. And so about the time the invitation song ended, they had finished up in the restroom, and I walked down the aisle. And to this day, I still think I turned that microphone off, but I didn't. It was still live. And I walked out of the auditorium. Well, there came Rhonda with Hannah and Claire. And Claire saw me, and she started running for me. And with my microphone still turned on in the auditorium while they're trying to pray, they hear me out in the lobby saying, "Well, Claire, Sugie, come here, come to Papa." And and they're all just cracking up. Well, needless to say, the prayer was over. And I had to get back in the pulpit that night and apologize for disrupting their worship, because there was a grown man that knows how to preach the gospel, hopefully, but all of a sudden he's a silly man saying, "Come to Papa, you Sugie, come on." And so she jumped in my arms. And that reminds me of another time that, see, I'm not showing you pictures, I'm just telling you stories. But that reminds me of another time that Hannah and Claire, when they were little girls, they came and stayed a week with us. And I make a point here for all of you grandparents. When our first grandchild was born, we told Rhonda, they're your children, and there are going to come some times when you could take a break from them and let them have a break from you. So when it's possible, let them come spend a few days with us or a week or whatever. And we've done that with all of our grandchildren. So that summer, these little girls, and they were so playful, and we were playful with them. I took a few hours away from my study and away from the office and went home, and we played games and watched videos and so on, and just played. And Mimi is the greatest Mimi I think anybody could ever be. And our grandkids, they just adore her. So when finally their visit was over and Rhonda took them back home, she started asking them, "Well, what all did you all do at Mimi's and Papa's?" "Oh, we played this and we played that, and Mimi is so funny. And then we would go play this, and that Mimi is so funny." And they kept on saying how funny Mimi is. And Rhonda finally said, "Well, what about Papa?" And Hannah said, "Well, he's mostly weird." Well, I never did try to dispute that. I just let it go. Let it be. Now, turning it on to you. There's one thing that I've always noticed that most grandparents have in common. When that first grandchild is born, you start trying to figure out, how could that boy that's not good enough for our daughter become the daddy of a beautiful little child like that? Or how could that girl that'll never be good enough for our son give birth to such a beautiful little baby? You know how that works? And you see in their lives so many things that just grab your attention. God has spoken about all of that. And I went into my computer and got on that program that would tell me such things. And the word grandchildren or grandchild is not found very often in most of the translations. In some editions of the New King James Version, you'll find it a time or two. But that which is found in some, like the American Standard Version, is children's children. That's grandchildren. Your children's children. And God has spoken about that. And the speaking that He did about it goes all the way back, as far as the records are concerned, goes all the way back to Moses' day. And when the Israelites were getting very close to that time when they would cross over the Jordan River into that promised land that God had promised to them, Moses had extensive words to say to them about it. And he had watched and he had seen, listen to this carefully now because this is so 2023, it's scary. He had seen so many families that at one point were devout followers of God, and they'd listened to the instructions from God, but they drifted away. And so many times God would have to approach them through prophets or through men whom God would use as His spokesman and say, come back, come back. Well, today, what do we call it? We call it apostasy. And you see it in churches, and you see it in families, and you see those who once were so faithful, now not so faithful. Moses knew, of course, before they crossed over the Jordan, he knew he wasn't going. God had told him, because you disobeyed me, you're not going over there. I'll let you see the land from a distance, but you're not going with them. So Moses preached some lengthy sermons to those Israelites. You find it in Deuteronomy, chapters 4, 5, 6, and so on. And essentially what Moses said to them is this: you've seen what God can do. You've seen Him in action in your lives, all the way back to crossing on the dry land where the Red Sea was. You've seen the miracles that He's done in your lives. You've seen His providential care. You have seen all of that. You have witnessed it. Make sure that you're telling all of that to your children and your grandchildren. Children and grandchildren do not always know the past, and regrettably, but realistically, they don't always appreciate the past. We're seeing this in the United States of America right now. That people do not know the heritage, they don't know the legacy that we have in this country, and the people that have paid the price with their own blood so that we can have the freedom and the peace that we have so wonderfully here now. And Moses said, tell it to them. That's in chapter 4, verse 9. Then in Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 and 7, he said, when you get up in the morning, and when you sit down to eat, and when you're taking a trip, and when you're going to bed at night, use those opportunities to tell your children where we all came from. Tell them the legacy. Tell them the prices that were paid for their liberty, for their freedom, for their blessings, for God's presence in their lives. Folks, what I just told you is, well, we just rounded off 5,000 years old. But is it ever so true? And I had the pleasure of being in Steve's office earlier with his wife, and I noticed some framed pictures in there. And I know from that, Steve appreciates the heritage that we have. And there are some of the greatest leaders of God's people, some of the greatest proclaimers of the precious gospel, are not even known to a large percentage of people in the church. They don't even know about them. And so how can you appreciate the ones you don't know? I want you to open your New Testaments with me to the book of 2 Timothy. The book of 2 Timothy, chapter 1. You know the Apostle Paul, and you know of Timothy. Timothy was his son in the faith. And Timothy was, in his younger years, needed to be encouraged. And Paul gave that encouragement. And when he wrote this second letter to Timothy, look down at verse 3, here's what he wrote. I thank God, whom I serve with a pure conscience, as my forefathers did, as without ceasing I remember you in my prayers night and day, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with joy when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also. Paul said, Timothy, I have great memories of you, and I have great thoughts about you. And I know when I talk to you, Timothy, and when I write these letters to you, I'm writing to somebody that has great faith. But he said, I know where that faith came from. It came from your mother. Well, where'd she get it? From her mother. Eunice was a grandmother. And she had the privilege of joining with her daughter in bringing up that boy named Timothy, who would become a great evangelist for God. And later on in this same letter, and then you know this, and to economize our time, I'm not going to read it all to you, I'll just encapsulate it for you. But Paul warned Timothy, he said there's some tough times coming, buddy. Some times that are going to really challenge your faith. And there are people that are going to suffer because of the hard times that are coming. But Timothy, you have known the scriptures since you were just a baby, and that's right here. When he calls him a child, those scriptures that you've known since you were a child, when you were taught, and if you look up those words in their original languages, you find he's not talking about a 5 or 6 year old. He's talking about somebody that's a toddler. He's talking about somebody that's just beginning life. And he said, I know when you were taught, they talked to you about that. So, granddaddies, how much are you talking to your grandchildren about God? Grandmothers, how frequently do you talk to your grandchildren about God, about the church, about the gospel, about Jesus Christ? And Paul wrote to Timothy there in 2 Timothy 3 verses 13 through 17, and he said, the scriptures thoroughly furnish us to every good work. And they are the scriptures that you've known since your childhood. Timothy, you stay in those scriptures because they make you wise unto salvation. And I'm looking at some young mamas and daddies in this audience. Wouldn't you want to have the security, the assurance that 20 years from now, that son, that daughter loves God and is faithful to God and lives the Christian life every day? And you would look at that child and say, that's a wise child. Paul said, here's where the wisdom comes from. Teaches you how to live life wisely. Turn over to Titus chapter 2, rather. Titus chapter 2. Paul wrote to Titus and said, as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine. Titus was a gospel preacher. He said, you speak what becomes sound doctrine. That the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. You know what he's talking about here? Older men, older women. So the implication is he is referring to grandparents. Yes, parents. Some of them become parents, well, like Maydell Hawkins, when she was 16 years old. But when you're young in years, you do not have the depth of experience, the depth of wisdom that you're going to have 20 years later, 30 years, 40 years later. And he's saying here, for the sake of these children, for the sake of your children, for the sake of the mothers of your grandchildren, teach them, train them. And I believe with all my heart that that path is not traveled as much as it ought to be. Oh, we know how to run to Barnes & Noble and buy another how-to book. We know how to get online and read about all of these experts and pieces of advice. But it is my personal conviction and conclusion that the best classroom for anyone, young mother, young father, or their children, the best classroom is at the feet of a godly, God-fearing grandparent. I want to tell you about somebody, and you've probably not met him, but you know who he is. Clarence Thomas, and a member of our Supreme Court in the United States. A man who has been criticized and abused verbally in so many ways. In 2007, he wrote an autobiography. And Clarence Thomas said, I want to tell you about the greatest man I've ever known. But it wasn't his daddy. It was the man that he always called daddy, but it was his granddaddy. His granddaddy went to the third grade. And that was it. He didn't have much to say around the house. He never showed affection. The family said he never showed affection to anybody in the family, even his grandkids. And he was a strict disciplinarian. And Clarence Thomas said, that's the greatest man I've ever known in my life. Why, Clarence? What distinguished him so much? And he had a word for it. Clarence Thomas put it in his book. He said, because of his preachments. His preachments. Look that up in the dictionary, see. You know what it is? It's his sayings. He had learned from life. He had learned without any formal education past the third grade, but he had learned some things that were valuable to know. And Clarence said, I remember as a boy, every day I was with him. I guess they're living close to each other, put them in proximity to each other. And he said every day, the day was filled with preachments. What he called a preachment was just what we call maybe a little Senate sermon. Something like, it's never right to do what's wrong. And it's never wrong to do what's right. That kind of thing. And he said he just filled his mind with those things. And if it's good, you be for it. If it's bad, have nothing to do with it. Those kind of things, his preachments. And years after he died and left this earth, that boy that heard all of that, when his daddy had died years, or his granddaddy rather, had died years earlier, and Clarence sat down to write about his life, that's what he remembered. And he said, it still affects me. It still influences me. The things that he would say about life, how to live life the right way. I want, in the few moments I have left, to say three things to you. First of all, I want to talk about the parents of your grandchildren. Respect them. And teach those grandchildren to respect them. And I know they're not perfect. They're not without their flaws. But when God wrote the scriptures, he said, children, obey your parents, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, Ephesians 6. And you need to respect God's teaching about that. And your grandchildren at times go, well, Mama's she's just not fair. She doesn't. And you go ahead and tell them. She's human. And she's going to make mistakes, just like I did with my children. But she's doing the best she knows how. And she may be saying to a child what David Sain said to both of his children at different times in their lives. And that was, I remember a time when Ava was just so put out with me, and Phyllis as well. And I looked at him and I said, Ava, I'm doing what we believe is the right thing. Thank you, Hunter. Okay. As I was saying, how powerful it is for words like that to come from somebody that they admire and adore and will listen to. And they need to understand, Mama has to be hard on you at times. Daddy has to be strict at times because they're responsible for guiding and instructing and encouraging you. And they're going to make some mistakes. And no mama and no daddy's ever lived that didn't make mistakes. So respect God's chain of command, so to speak, and teach them to respect their parents. And by the way, parents of grandchildren, you don't get to get your way every time with grandchildren. And your children are going to decide some things and do some things with your grandchildren that you will not agree with. I promise you that has either already happened or it's going to happen, but when it's happened, you do what a good friend of Phyllis and me said to us. She was talking to us one time about her children and what they were doing with their children. And she said, and I don't agree with it, but I know what my role is. Be quiet and color. She said, I understand it really well. That's my role, just be quiet and color. You don't always get to control things. And that's one of the changes of command when a grandbaby's born. The second thing is, reinforce good morals, assuming and hopefully your children will be teaching your grandchildren. And hopefully they're going to get a lot of that at home, because regrettably in a lot of public schools at least, they don't get a lot. But when they're taught good morals, reinforce it. And let them know that your mother or let them know that your grandchildren need to know that their mothers and their fathers haven't lost their mind. And they want what is best for you. And they will teach you. And you may not understand it. You may not agree with it. But listen to them. And number 3, reassure those grandchildren frequently how much you love them. I'm not through. Are you listening? Reassure them frequently that how much you love them, which if they understand and you understand, here's what that means. Because I love you, I want what is right and best for you. And I will always do that which I believe is right and best. And if I say anything tonight that you need to take home, get this. Don't leave out. Oh, don't forget to tell them. You're not perfect. You get that, child, daughter, son? You're not perfect. Your daddy's not perfect. And you're going to make some mistakes. And you're going to hurt me at times when you make your mistakes. And I'm going to be disappointed in you when you make mistakes. particularly those big mistakes that affect your whole life. And I will never make excuses for you. And I will never look the other way and act like it's okay. But I love you enough that I will wait. And when you decide to do what's right, I'm going to hug you. And I'm going to forgive you. You let that child know. Listen, let that child know there is nothing that you could do that would cause me to stop loving you. I may not like what you're doing. I may disapprove with what you're doing. I may be hurt through and through by what you are doing, but I will never stop loving you, and I will always be ready to help you do what is right. And I'll tell you what I believe. 100 years from now, it will not matter what kind of car Phyllis and I drove. It'll not matter what kind of house we lived in. It'll not matter what our bank account was like. But 100 years from now, my prayer is that the world will be a better place to live and our grandchildren will be better because we made a difference in their lives. That's what it means to be a grandparent. And you're not going to always please your grandchildren. And by the way, one other thing, when they started coming to our house once a year, the first time that happened with Rhonda, I looked at her and I said, Rhonda, here's the deal. When you're around, if you're present, that child is yours, and he's your responsibility. But when you're not present, and that child is with me, that child is my responsibility, and I will make him behave like I made you behave. But I'm not going to take your place when you're present. Well, I have more material, but I must stop. I just know from experience, they'll outgrow your lap, but they'll never outgrow your heart. Thank you for listening so wonderfully. And we'll wait till the children in the classes come back in, and I'll extend the invitation.